Hey guys, and welcome back for another episode in my history series, where today we're going to be talking about how a little bit of mould changed the whole world, which is hopefully my more clickbaity title to draw you in to learn all about the discovery of penicillin. I know a lot of us probably learned all about the discovery of penicillin and Alexander Fleming at school, but you probably heard the BBC bite-sized version. Turns out that the full story is a lot more interesting, and whilst Fleming is the name we all know today as the reason why we're able to fight pesky bacteria with relative ease, it turns out it was much more of a group effort than we're generally led to believe. Of course it was. I want to give a huge thank you to Magellan TV for sponsoring us today, the documentary streaming service. I'm sure you've all already heard over the years why I love Magellan TV. They have sponsored me for a really long time. So instead of listing all of those reasons, I'm just going to jump straight in and tell you about a documentary series I've watched recently and I know so many of you would find fascinating as well. It's Predict My Future, The Science of Us. I thought I'd go with a more sciencey recommendation today to stick with the theme of this video. So this is a 4-episode documentary series focusing on different parts of human life as it attempts to answer the fundamental question of what exactly makes us who we are. What is it that makes me and you so different? Is it nature? Is it nurture? In the documentary, we're introduced to the Dunadine Longitudinal study, started in 1972 and continuing to today, following the lives of over 1,000 New Zealanders since birth. For decades in this study, every aspect of these humans' health and development has been monitored. It's been the broadest and most in-depth study of humans ever conducted, and it's still ongoing. Each episode focuses on a different period or aspect of the life of the subjects. So you've got early years, troubled teenage years, then you've got an episode on the subjects who've ended up on the wrong side of the law, looking at this nature versus nurture thing. And then the final episode is modern life, taking a look at the effects of poverty, of social isolation, how cleanliness affects illnesses. It's a truly fascinating series and I cannot recommend it enough. If you're interested in humanity, in what makes you you and me, then this is the documentary series for you. It was so interesting. If you want to try out Magellan TV for yourself and watch Predict My Future, The Science of Us, then you can click on the link in the top line of the description box down below to claim your 1-month free trial. Magellan TV have more true crime and history documentaries and science documentaries than you could dream of. Alexander Fleming was born on the 6th of August 1881 near a small town in Ayrshire, Scotland called Farvel. He was the third child of a farmer couple, Hugh Fleming and Grace Sterling Morton, and his father sadly died when he was just 7 years old. So from there, Grace was left to run the farm with the help of her older stepson, Hugh's son from a previous marriage. But Alexander wasn't interested in the farm life. He was always very focused on his studies. It was clear from early on that Alexander was a smart kid, especially when he was awarded a 2-year scholarship to Kilmarnock School, which is a school that matches only Eton College in the number of Nobel laureate graduates that it creates. At the age of 13, Alexander followed an older stepbrother down to London. This stepbrother was already a physician, a doctor, but Alexander didn't go down to London intending to follow in his brother's footsteps. Once there, he would attend the Royal Polytechnic Institution, which is now the University of Westminster, and then he worked in a shipping office for a few years. It wasn't until Alexander was 20 years old that he inherited some money from an uncle, and it was suggested by his stepbrother that he train to become a physician too. So that's what he did. In 1903, he enrolled at St Mary's Hospital Medical School, where he earned a degree in 1906. After graduating, Alexander joined the research department of St Mary's as an assistant bacteriologist under the guidance of a man called Sir Armroth Wright. He's most known for his work in the vaccine field, and Wright developed a system of inoculation against typhoid amongst many other things. Working underneath this man would have been a great honour to anyone, and Alexander was convinced to become his assistant. Alexander actually wanted to train to become a surgeon, but it turns out that he was actually a really good sharpshooter and was a key member of the university's rifle club. If he went on to become a surgeon, then the rifle club would have lost him, but if he continued working at the university, he could stay in the club. So they convinced him of a career in research at the university, and the rest is history. He would stay with this same research group for the rest of his career. In 1908, he won a gold medal for being the top medical student at the university and also gained a Bachelor of Science degree in bacteriology. Alexander would later go on to become a lecturer at this university himself. In 1915, he married a nurse, Sarah Marion McElroy, and they had a son, Robert, 9 years later, who would also go on to become a doctor. For a few years, Alexander held a private practice specialising in the treatment of venereal diseases, particularly in syphilis, and became one of the first people in Britain to use a new drug that would prove to be very effective against syphilis. But when World War I broke out, it was indisputable that he was going to have to join the war effort, being the fantastic sharpshooter that he was. Alexander served in the Army Medical Corps as a captain, during which time he saw the deaths of many of his fellow soldiers. And not even necessarily from gunshot wounds or other horrific battlefield injuries, but from infections. Time and time again, it was infections taking soldiers out. Fleming noted at the time that the bacteria in deep wounds seemed resistant to the regular treatments at the time, and the regular treatment was just antiseptics. But antiseptics would also remove all the good bacteria from the wounds as well as the bad, and rarely actually helped. Alexander decided this is what he wanted to research, why antiseptics were actually killing more soldiers than the actual infections during the war. In 1917, he published an article exploring this in a medical journal called The Lancet, where he described an experiment that he'd conducted. He used his own glass-blowing skills, because of course he had glass-blowing skills, to prove that whilst antiseptics worked well on the surface of a wound, deep wounds sheltered the bad bacteria and antiseptics did nothing to help. His research into this wasn't really widely accepted at the time, but this was in the middle of the war. There weren't many resources available for researching this any further, and what were they going to do? Stop using antiseptics altogether and instead just use nothing? I mean, that wasn't really an option. But Alexander was undeterred. Now, something that's really important to know about Alexander Fleming was that he was not a tidy or clean researcher, and it was quite common for his culture plates to have picked up bacteria from the room. Perhaps that's something that will make biologists today shudder. But without this messy trait of his, we wouldn't have penicillin, nor would we have his first big discovery, which was Lysozyme. Lysozyme is an enzyme that is found to have natural antiseptic values and is found in many different bodily fluids, and was only discovered one day when Fleming had a cold and a drop of mucus, snot, fell from his nose onto a petri dish that he was using. Some sources say that he placed mucus there on purpose, but it is a better story to say it's an accident, isn't it? But then Alexander went away. He forgot about this dish for about 2 weeks in all the clutter of his lab. In that time, numerous colonies of bacteria grew. 2 weeks later, when he rediscovered the dish, he saw something fascinating. The area where his mucus had dropped remained clear. There was no bacteria there at all. So, of course, being a scientist, he researched further. What exactly was it in the mucus that had caused this, or was it just a fluke? He put some bacteria in a saline that formed this yellow suspension and added fresh mucus. But within 2 minutes of this, the suspension turned clear. Clearly there was something in this that was fighting bacteria, and he found himself wondering, what other bodily fluids could you find this phenomenon in? He decided the next thing he was going to test was tears, and roped in co-workers for their tears. For weeks, this whole lab was just everyone trying to make themselves cry for the good of science, using lemons and onions and just thinking sad thoughts. It turns out tears also had the same effect on bacteria. Bacteria wouldn't grow in it. So Alexander extended his scope, testing blood, semen, pus, cartilage, and more. And whatever contained this agent that was killing the bacteria was found in all of it. Despite his own excitement around this though, again, it didn't stir up much in the scientific community, who just didn't really care. This was huge though. It was proof that the human body produced its own antibacterial agent. Through some testing, he soon discovered the exact substance, the enzyme that was doing this, and named it Lysozyme, from the word lysing meaning dissolving, and enzyme, obviously. He also discovered that lysozyme was found in egg whites, in which he was able to isolate large amounts for his testing. But his experiments soon found that it was only effective against a small number of non-harmful bacteria. So this experiment, this discovery, wasn't exactly going to change the medical field, but it was interesting because it laid the groundwork for his next huge discovery that would come just a few years later. That huge discovery, of course, was penicillin. Alexander was investigating Staphylococcus at this time, which is a common type of bacteria responsible for skin infections, so boils, impetigo, cellulitis, and more. It was really common in both horses and humans. Although a skin infection doesn't sound too disastrous, if a patient with a weakened immune system was to contract Staphylococcus, the symptoms could be much more severe, and that's what Alexander was working to try and prevent, beginning with a series of experiments with the Staphylococcus bacteria. In 1928, he was specifically studying a variation of Staphylococcus grown under natural conditions, and in his ever so messy work style, he had a number of different petri dishes strewn all over his workbench. And then Alexander went off on holiday with his family for a couple of weeks, just leaving it all there. On his return, his first order of business was to sort through all of these petri dishes, and on one he noticed something unusual. It was dotted with colonies of the staph bacteria, except for one area where there was this blob of mould growing. The dish had clearly got infected in its preparation, of course. The agar jelly immediately surrounding the mould, though, was clear, as if the mould had secreted something that stopped bacterial growth. And this is something that Fleming would refer to as mould juice. The colonies of bacteria immediately surrounding the mould were dying away, whilst the colonies further away were normal. He remarked, "That's funny," and showed a lab assistant who reminded him that he discovered lysozyme under very similar circumstances. Fleming would later say, "When I woke up just after dawn on September 28, 1928, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionise all medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic, a bacteria killer. But I suppose that was exactly what I did." This was obviously something that needed to be explored further, but it took Alexander a few more weeks to grow enough of this mould to do further experiments. He had identified it as a mould called Penicillin notatum. In the meantime, he tested on other moulds, finding that this one, Penicillin notatum, was the only one that secreted this antibacterial mould juice, but he did struggle to isolate the exact component that was responsible for this antibacterial effect. Nevertheless, he named his discovery penicillin and continued his testing its effects against many different bacterias. He also tested to see if it was toxic for lab animals, and it wasn't. Now, this was 1928, and Fleming didn't quite understand the full uses of such a thing like penicillin yet. He was perhaps limited by his understanding of medicine at the time. He didn't inject any of the lab animals with Staphylococcus or any other bacteria before injecting them with the penicillin, so we never quite saw the full effect of what could happen if he had done that. Perhaps he was focusing more on its use as a topical antiseptic applied to the skin rather than an ingestible or injectable medicine. Also, the difficulties he had just isolating the penicillin meant that he was a bit preoccupied. That took all of his time up. You'd think this whole thing must have been huge at the time, right? Like another huge medical innovation by Dr. Alexander Fleming. But once again, the scientific community paid little attention. He published a paper in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology in June 1929, but nobody really saw it, and those who did weren't able to find any fuller understanding of how penicillin worked than Alexander himself. He pondered over his discovery for the next decade, but ultimately sort of just moved on to other areas of research. It wasn't until 1937 that things really started to kick off. At this time, Alexander was nearing 60 years old and was contemplating retirement when two researchers at Oxford University, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, took it upon themselves to continue the research into penicillin, and they also pulled in a fungal expert called Norman Heatley. Florey and Chain had uncovered Alexander's research and had assembled their own team of scientists to work on what they called the Penicillin Project. And it was rough. Both these men were very strong personalities, they both wanted to be in charge. There were a lot of arguments, meaning that they weren't really focusing on what they were trying to do, which was to purify penicillin from this mould. 3 years went by of trial and error until they were eventually able to produce pure penicillin through what was a very long and inefficient process. Turns out that you needed gallons of this famous mould juice to produce just a fingernail's amount of penicillin, but they had done it, and that was important. Eventually, after a lot of work, they had enough penicillin to start animal trials. They used bedpans, milk-churned, bathtubs to store this mould juice until they eventually developed fermentation vessels to hold it in. These vessels also did mean that the mould juice could be transported more easily for further and easier testing. The Oxford lab became somewhat of a penicillin factory, and they had to employ 6 women who came to be known as the Penicillin Girls to look after the juice, and it was their job to farm the tiny amount of penicillin that fermented each week. This was a full-time job in itself, but it still simply wasn't providing enough penicillin, something that became very obvious when it was time for human trials to start. A 43-year-old man called Albert Alexander was one of the very first test subjects. He had a life-threatening infection and was given penicillin to treat it. But when the penicillin ran out before his treatment had been completed, the infection returned full force and Albert sadly died just days later. Other people with lesser infections were being successfully treated and cured of their infections, but the production was a huge problem here, and so the scientists turned to whatever methods they could to obtain penicillin. That means when they found out that about 80% of a dose of penicillin is excreted from our bodies in our urine, it became somebody's job to go on pee patrol and collect patients' urine so the penicillin could be extracted and reused. Something totally safe, but not the nicest thing to think about. This was all happening around 1941, and of course World War II was in full swing at this time, so no factories could free up the space or the time to develop penicillin on a larger scale, even if it could have saved many lives. So Florey and Heatley head to the USA, where a new team was set up in Peoria, Illinois at the Department of Agriculture. They were experts in fermentation, and soon the scientists there were able to develop new deep fermentation tanks to speed up this whole process. They discovered that when they added corn steep liquor, a byproduct of cornstarch, to the mould broth, the yield of penicillin grew hugely, as this just so happened to provide the perfect environment for mould fermentation. They also embarked on a global search for other strains of mould with higher percentages of penicillin, and other scientists from around the whole world sent soil samples. In the end, it was actually a lab assistant who discovered a better mould when she went to the local market and came back with a mouldy cantaloupe melon. They found that this strain of mould, P. chrysogenum, produced 6 times more penicillin than the original Penicillium. From there, things started to snowball in terms of production, finally. Eventually, Florey headed east to try and convince the US government to get involved in the production, whilst Heatley remained in Illinois to head off production, and luckily the government were interested in helping. The general public and the US pharmaceutical companies were hesitant at first to really get on board with penicillin, as people generally are when it comes to new things in the medical field. But by the end of that year, 1941, the USA had joined World War II, and they realised just how much they needed a miracle drug to treat infections. If they didn't have this, people were going to die. By 1943, the USA had produced enough penicillin to not only treat their own forces, but all of the Allied forces as well. According to records, there were only 400 million units of penicillin available in the first few months of 1943. By the end of the war, US companies were making 650 billion units a month. Penicillin was likely a huge help in the Allies' eventual victory in the war. At least many more people arrived home safely than they would have done without it. It saved a lot of lives. The United States and Britain started cooperating on penicillin production, and together they really managed to get it down. The British government actually went to great lengths to stop enemies at war finding out about the blueprint for penicillin. The Allies really had the upper hand with this miracle drug, and it was a huge help in keeping their troops strong. If they knew the enemies had got a hold of it, that upper hand would be gone. But of course, they did get a hold of it. In the decade between Fleming's discovery and the Oxford team getting involved, Fleming had sent out samples of the penicillin mould across the whole world to try and get answers, including a sample sent to Germany in the 1930s to a Dr. H. Schmidt. Schmidt wasn't able to get the mould to grow himself, but other places in Europe had received viable strains of it. This wasn't Fleming's fault. He wasn't to know what would come over the next decade. He just wanted to get answers in this huge scientific discovery. But soon, penicillin was being produced across the world, and as the UK and US had done, many places did struggle with the large-scale production. By October 1944, the Nazis had succeeded in making penicillin, but Allied air raids meant that mass production just wasn't possible, so that was something that did still help in the war. So, as you can see, there were a lot more people involved in this beginning to end than just Alexander Fleming. But his part here can't be minimised. Without him, who knows how long the discovery of penicillin would have taken, if it ever would have happened. But bringing penicillin to the general public was much more of a team effort. The myth that it was just Alexander was probably compounded when in August 1942 he got hold of some of Oxford's penicillin supply and successfully treated a patient who was dying of streptococcal meningitis. When this patient survived, it was huge. There was a big article in the Times about it, and neither Fleming nor Florey were named in the article, but Sir Armroth Wright, so Fleming's boss, was very quick to write to the Times to tell them all about his protege's work. Fleming was very happy to speak to the press when they contacted him about this, but Florey wasn't interested and also prohibited any member of the Oxford team working on this to talk to the press either, which is probably how things kind of got lost in translation. It was much more of a team effort than we're generally led to believe. By 1946, penicillin became available in the UK for public use, the year after Fleming, Chain and Florey were awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology for their discovery. They all won the prize. After penicillin was isolated from other microorganisms, the term antibiotics was dubbed, and this production technique was applied to other discoveries as well, leading to many more antibiotics found over the next couple of decades. Streptomycin, erythromycin, vancomycin, and more. Which was great because a lot of people are actually allergic to penicillin, or at least think they're allergic. About 10% of the population claim to be allergic to penicillin, and it's not that they're lying because a lot of children do experience adverse reactions or are genuinely allergic, but a huge amount of these children will lose their sensitivity to penicillin over time. Less than 2% will remain allergic into adulthood. But of course, once you think you're allergic to something or you've suffered reactions in the past, it's a bit of a risk to try it again, so a lot of people think it's safer just to steer clear. The only way you can get an answer for sure as to whether or not you're really allergic is to go to an allergist as an adult, but of course that's not something everyone can afford. But then again, penicillin as an antibiotic is a lot cheaper than some of the other alternatives, so if you don't live in a country with socialised healthcare, that could be something to bear in mind. Interestingly, my nan was actually allergic to penicillin, and so is my dad, I think. I'm not allergic, but other antibiotics are generally much more effective for me than penicillin. When I was about 21 years old, I got bronchitis. It was put on a course of penicillin for a week, and it made me so much worse. I've never been so ill in my life. I switched to a different antibiotic and recovered quite quickly after that point. Me and my doctor still don't really know what that was, whether it was just a slight allergy that I do have or just a resistant strain of bronchitis, but they do generally give me other antibiotics now just in case. But that is a problem. A lot of bacteria is now becoming resistant to penicillin because in the past few decades humankind has relied on it too much. Bacteria strains mutate to survive. MRSA is one of the prime examples, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and as a result it's really difficult to treat MRSA infections and causes a lot of death. Scientists are constantly working on new treatments, but that's why it's important that we don't become too reliant on antibiotics. But what's the other option? Just letting people die? It's really difficult and does pose a moral question. And on that cheery note, that's where this episode is coming to an end. Alexander Fleming accidentally made a discovery that changed the world forever, but he wasn't the only person involved here. It's important that we remember the names of Ernst Chain, Howard Florey and Norman Heatley as well, because without them we wouldn't have what we have today. Alexander Fleming died suddenly at home on the 11th of March 1955 of coronary thrombosis, quickly and quietly. He'd been suffering with gastric problems for some weeks, but his doctor didn't think it was anything that warranted a home visit after Alexander's wife called to call him out. A few minutes later, he died, leaving behind a legacy that most people couldn't even imagine. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you found this as interesting as I did, and if you know any other history or medical or science nerds in your life, then please do share my video and this channel with them. It would really help me out. A huge thank you to Magellan TV for sponsoring us today. Again, I'll leave their link in the top line of the description box, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.